a routine traffic stop, until the officer saw the terrified little girl in the back seat, and his blood ran cold. The suburban streets stretched out before him, bathed in the dull orange glow of streetlights. It was a quiet evening. Sergeant Jimmy Christian had been on patrol for the past 3 hours. The hum of the engine his only companion. The dashboard clock read 8 p.m. So far, the night had been uneventful. No domestic disturbances, no reckless drivers, just the usual rhythm of a small town settling in for the night. Still, Jimmy knew better than to let his guard down. Years on the force had taught him that trouble had a way of creeping in when you least expected it. Up ahead, his headlights caught a glimpse of movement. A battered old sedan rolled through a stop sign without slowing down. Not a flagrant offense, but enough to warrant a stop. Jimmy sighed, reaching for the switch. The blue and red lights flashed to life, washing over the street in rhythmic pulses. The sedan hesitated before pulling over to the curb. Jimmy radioed in the stop, his voice calm, professional. "Dispatch, this is Christian, pulling over a silver sedan, plate 5G6872, routine traffic stop, no assistance needed." He slid out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt as he approached the driver's side window. The crisp night air carried the distant hum of crickets, a stark contrast to the growing unease pressing against his chest. The window rolled down smoothly. Adam Blake. That was the name on the license the driver handed over. Late 40s, neatly dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks. Not the kind of outfit you expected at this hour. His hair was combed back, his expression carefully measured. A polite smile stretched across his face. "Good evening, officer," Blake said, his voice even, almost rehearsed. "Is there a problem?" Jimmy kept his tone neutral. "You ran a stop sign back there. Any reason for the rush?" Blake let out a soft chuckle, a little too forced. "My apologies. Long day. Just trying to get home." Jimmy nodded, shifting his gaze to the back seat. That was when he saw her. A little G child, no older than 7, sat clutching a worn-out doll to her chest. Her dark skin contrasted sharply against the pale fabric of the toy. She was small, too still. Something about the way she gripped the doll, how her shoulders tensed, sent a ripple of unease through Jimmy's gut. "That your daughter?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Blake didn't hesitate. "Yes, this is Kristen. We've been at my sister's for dinner. She's exhausted." Kristen's head bobbed slightly as if agreeing, but the movement felt unnatural, mechanical. "Hey there, sweetheart," Jimmy said gently, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "You doing okay?" For a brief moment, her eyes flicked up to his, wide, fearful. But then, almost immediately, she looked away. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Jimmy barely heard it. Before he could press further, Blake's hand rested on the girl's small shoulder, a fatherly gesture on the surface. But the way Kristen stiffened, the way her tiny fingers clenched the fabric of her dress, it was enough to set every alarm in Jimmy's mind blaring. Something was wrong. "Where's home?" Jimmy asked, watching Blake closely. "Western Hills, near the park." Blake answered smoothly, too smoothly. The address matched the registration. No warrants, no prior citations. On paper, Adam Blake was just another ordinary citizen. But Jimmy had been doing this job too long to ignore a gut feeling. He studied Kristen again. She hadn't moved, hadn't relaxed, hadn't spoken beyond that one quiet, fearful whisper. Everything about her screamed distress, but there was nothing concrete to hold them on. Blake was watching him carefully now, the thin layer of sweat on his forehead betraying the calm facade. Jimmy let the silence stretch, waiting to see if the man would break under the weight of it. He didn't. Finally, Jimmy exhaled. He had nothing solid to keep them here. No missing child report, no sign of immediate danger. If he pushed too hard without cause, he risked spooking the man, losing whatever chance he had at figuring out the truth. He forced himself to take a step back. "All right. Just be more careful at intersections, sir. Drive safe." Blake nodded too quickly, too eagerly, like a man desperate to be dismissed. "Of course, officer. Won't happen again." Jimmy watched as the sedan pulled away, its taillights fading into the night. The unease in his chest didn't fade with it. He lingered by his cruiser, staring down the empty road, fingers tightening around his notepad. Slowly, deliberately, he jotted down the plate number. 5G6872. Something wasn't right. And Jimmy Christian wasn't the kind of cop to ignore his gut. The station was quiet when Sergeant Jimmy Christian returned, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over rows of empty desks. It was almost 9:30 p.m. His shift wasn't over, but Jimmy could feel the weight of the evening pressing down on him. He dropped into his chair, fingers drumming against the wooden desk. 5G6872. The plate number was burned into his memory. Adam Blake. Kristen. The girl's wide, fearful eyes flashed in his mind again. He couldn't let it go. Jimmy leaned forward and pulled up the state vehicle database, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. Within seconds, the results appeared on the screen. Adam Blake. Age 47. Registered owner of a silver sedan. No prior arrests. No outstanding warrants. On paper, Blake was clean. Jimmy exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. He had expected that. If something was off, it wouldn't be in plain sight. He needed to dig deeper. He ran Blake's name through the national database, searching for anything, even the smallest infraction, and then something surfaced. Not a conviction, not an arrest, but a pattern. Adam Blake. Questioned in 3 separate investigations involving missing children, never charged, never convicted, but always there, lingering on the edges of cases in different states. Jimmy's pulse quickened. First, Ohio. A black 6-year-old boy vanished from a shopping mall. The investigation stalled. Blake was questioned as a potential witness but released. Then, Texas. A black girl, 8 years old, disappeared from a public park. Another dead end. Blake's name appeared again, briefly, but there was no direct connection. And now, here. Jimmy sat back, a chill running through him. How many times could someone be near a missing child case before it became more than coincidence? The unease in his stomach turned into something sharper. He clicked out of the database and reached for his notebook, flipping to where he had written the plate number. His other hand hovered over his radio, hesitating for only a second before pressing the call button. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Christian. I need to access traffic cam footage from earlier tonight. Can you pull up records from the main road near the intersection of Pine and Jefferson, around 8:01 p.m.? "Copy that, Christian. We'll check and send it over." Jimmy leaned back, exhaling slowly. There was more to this. He knew it. But he needed something, anything solid. A few minutes later, a soft chime from his dashboard console signaled an incoming file, the dashcam footage from his own patrol car. He opened the file, watching the grainy black and white video play out on the screen. There was Blake, his polite smile. Kristen, stiff in the back seat. Jimmy frowned, clicking to slow down the playback, his eyes zeroed in on the girl's lips, barely moving. And then, 2 words. "Help me." A slow chill spread through him. He played it again, and again. "Help me!" She had been begging for help, and he hadn't seen it. Jimmy's breath came heavier, his grip tightened on the desk. God damn it! He had let her go. His chest tightened as he switched screens, pulling up the National Missing Children database. If he was right, if Kristen wasn't just some quiet, exhausted child, then her name would be there. He typed quickly. Kristen Harper, age 7, reported missing 3 days ago. Ridgefield. The blood drained from his face. It was her. A full-color photo stared back at him, same dark eyes, same small, fragile frame. Her parents had filed a missing person report 3 nights ago. Witnesses saw her playing at a local playground before she disappeared. 3 days. 3 days was too long. Jimmy slammed his palm against the desk, shoving his chair back as he stood. He had to move. Now. He grabbed the radio again, his voice sharper this time. Dispatch, I need an APB on a silver sedan, plate number 5G6872. Driver, Adam Blake. Possible child abduction case. Confirmed match with active Amber Alert. Copy that, Christian. Sending out the bulletin now. His mind was racing ahead, calculating possibilities, routes, Blake's next move. If Blake had been involved in other cases, he wouldn't be stupid enough to take Kristen back home. He needed help. Jimmy grabbed his phone, scrolling to a name he knew he could trust. Chadwick Boseman, a seasoned officer, one of the few men Jimmy respected on the force. If there was someone he wanted watching his back tonight, it was Chadwick. The line rang twice before the older man picked up. Christian? Boseman's voice was gruff, no nonsense. I need you on this, Chad, Jimmy said, wasting no time. 7-year-old girl, Kristen Harper, reported missing 3 days ago. I stopped the car she was in tonight. Let them go. Thought something was off. Just ran the plate. Adam Blake has been on the edges of multiple missing child cases. Got him linked to an active Amber Alert. A beat of silence. Then, where do you need me? Jimmy grabbed his jacket, already heading for the door. Meet me at the station. We're finding this son of a bitch before it's too late. He killed the call, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Across from him, Detective Sarah Caldwell was speaking with a young waitress, her voice low but urgent. The girl nodded quickly, shifting from foot to foot, her hands twisting in the hem of her apron. Jimmy caught fragments of their conversation as he approached. Yes, I saw them. Just a couple hours ago. The man seemed nervous. The little girl. She wasn't talking. She just kept holding that doll. Tight. Too tight. You're sure it was them? Sarah pressed. The waitress glanced toward the window as if expecting to see the man still standing outside. She shivered. Silver sedan. Dark-haired man in his 40s. And the girl, yes. She had those big, scared eyes. I should have said something, but I wasn't sure. Jimmy reached into his pocket, pulling out his notebook. 5G6872. He held it up. Did you see this plate? The waitress hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, that's the one. Jimmy exchanged a glance with Sarah. It was him. The tension that had been simmering in his gut flared into something sharper. They were close. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, then looked up, her expression grim. Got a location. Lakeside Inn. He checked in less than an hour ago. Jimmy didn't waste a second. Let's move. Lakeside Inn sat at the edge of town, a place that had seen better days. The sign flickered against the darkness, its paint peeling, letters missing. A single-story row of rooms stretched across the parking lot, each door identical, each window covered with cheap curtains. Jimmy pulled in beside Sarah's car, their headlights sweeping over the silver sedan parked near room 14. He's here, Sarah murmured. Jimmy nodded, his grip tightening on his radio. We go in quiet. No sirens. No warning. Sarah pulled her weapon from its holster, checking the chamber. Let's do this. They moved in tandem, keeping to the shadows, their footsteps near silent against the cracked pavement. The door to room 14 was shut, the curtains drawn. But inside, Jimmy could see faint movement. Someone pacing. Adam. Jimmy held up a hand, signaling Sarah to stay ready. Then they waited. Minutes ticked by. Then the door creaked open. Adam Blake stepped out, a cigarette between his fingers. His eyes scanned the parking lot, wary, but he didn't see them, not until Jimmy was already moving. In 2 quick strides, Jimmy grabbed Adam's arm, twisting it behind his back before the man could react. "Don't move," Jimmy growled. Adam let out a sharp grunt of pain, the cigarette dropping to the ground. "Hey, what the hell?" Sarah moved in, securing his other wrist, snapping handcuffs into place. Adam twisted, his face contorted in something between anger and forced confusion. "What is this? You can't just—" Jimmy turned him around, locking eyes with the man. "Where is she?" Adam's expression flickered just for a second, a crack in the calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jimmy's grip tightened. "Kristen Harper, where is she?" Adam held his gaze, then smiled. Slow, cruel. "She's gone." A cold wave crashed through Jimmy. "What did you do?" Adam chuckled, shaking his head. "You're too late." Jimmy shoved him toward the police cruiser, his mind racing. Too late for what? He turned back toward the motel door, Sarah already stepping inside. The room was a mess, sheets tangled, a suitcase half open on the floor, but no sign of Kristen. Only her doll, lying abandoned near the bed. Sarah's voice was tight. She was here. Jimmy picked up the doll, his fingers tracing the fabric. And then, from outside, in the distance, a sound, a rustling. Then, the faint crack of a branch. Jimmy's pulse jumped. "She ran," Sarah whispered. Jimmy bolted for the door. Behind the motel, a thin stretch of woods loomed in the darkness. The branches twisted and gnarled, shadows stretching long beneath the moonlight. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He ran. Leaves crunched beneath his boots. A blur of movement ahead. Small, fast. "Kristen!" he called. No answer. Then another sound. Not from her. From somewhere else. A figure. Moving between the trees. Jimmy stopped cold. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This wasn't just a missing girl. Someone else was out here. Someone chasing her. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. "Jimmy? What's going on?" Jimmy barely breathed. Then the scream cut through the silence. High. Terrified. "Kristen!" Jimmy ran toward the sound, heart pounding. And ahead, deep in the shadows, a man stepped into view. Tall, face obscured by darkness. And in his arms, Kristen. Jimmy barely had time to react before the man turned and disappeared into the trees, and Kristen's scream faded into the night. The night had swallowed Kristen. The girl ran, her small feet barely making a sound against the damp earth, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. Somewhere behind her, she could still hear him, the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crashing through the underbrush like a predator closing in on its prey. Her heart pounded violently. She had no sense of direction, no plan, only the primal instinct that screamed at her to keep moving, to push forward even though her legs trembled with exhaustion. She still remembered the feeling of Adam's hand closing around her wrist, the way his grip would tighten whenever she hesitated, the warning in his voice when she cried. The past days had been a nightmare, but this moment, this frantic, desperate escape, felt even worse. Because now she knew the truth. Now she understood what would happen if they caught her again. Somewhere in the distance, another sound broke through the trees. A voice. Low, urgent. "Kristen!" Jimmy. A different kind of fear gripped her chest. He was here. He was chasing after her. But was he fast enough? Could he find her before the other one did? Then, another noise. A third set of footsteps. Kristen's stomach twisted. Someone else was out here. She swallowed hard, her pulse thudding against her ribs. She had to keep running, but her body betrayed her. Her foot caught on something, a thick root, slick with rain. Before she could catch herself, she fell forward, hard. Pain shot up her knees, raw scrapes burning against the cold dirt. And then, before she could push herself up, a hand clamped over her mouth. Kristen screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the thick night. She thrashed, kicking wildly, but the grip around her waist tightened. She was being dragged backward into the darkness. She twisted her head, forcing herself to look. Not Adam, someone else. A stranger, taller, stronger, colder. His breath was hot against her ear, his voice a quiet snarl. "You shouldn't have run." Kristen's entire body locked up. Her mind screamed at her to fight, but fear wrapped its icy fingers around her, holding her in place. "Bo, con, be, ra!" Jimmy's voice rang through the trees, sharp as a gunshot. The man holding her stilled. Then, slowly, he turned. Kristen could feel his grip shift, tighter, almost thoughtful, like he was deciding what to do next. Jimmy's flashlight cut through the dark, its beam landing directly on them. For the first time she saw his face, a stranger, a monster. He was smiling. "You want her," he taunted. His fingers dug painfully into her arms. "Come and get her." And then Kristen moved. She bit down, hard. The man yelled, jerking his hand back in pain, and in that instant she tore away from his grip. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He lunged, tackling the man to the ground. They hit the dirt hard, rolling through the mud in a vicious struggle. Kristen scrambled backward, her breath coming in frantic gasps as she watched. The man was strong, too strong. Jimmy landed a solid punch, but the attacker barely faltered. A flash of silver, a knife. Kristen's stomach dropped. The man slashed. Jimmy jerked back, but not fast enough. A dark stain bloomed across his sleeve. Kristen's body felt frozen. She wanted to run. She wanted to stay. She wanted this to be over. But Jimmy didn't stop. Even with blood soaking his arm, he kept fighting, kept pushing. And then a sharp, piercing sound cut through the night. Sirens. Flashing lights appeared between the trees, streaks of red and blue slicing through the darkness. Sarah. The backup. They were here. The man heard it too. His head snapped up, his grip faltering for just a second. But a second was all Jimmy needed. With one final push, Jimmy knocked the knife from the man's hand and drove him into the ground. Kristen flinched at the sickening crunch as the stranger's head hit the dirt. Then silence. The man wasn't getting back up. Jimmy rolled off him, his breath ragged, his injured arm cradled against his chest. But his eyes searched for her immediately. "Kristen?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. She was still staring at the man on the ground, waiting for him to move, waiting for this not to be over. But it was over. Slowly, cautiously, she took a step forward, and then another. And then she ran, straight into Jimmy's arms. She felt his steady heartbeat, the warmth of his jacket, the strength in his arms as they wrapped around her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't scared. The interrogation room was cold. The air, stale with the faint scent of old coffee and the ink from countless reports, seemed to weigh heavier than usual. Adam Blake sat in the metal chair, his hands cuffed to the table, his composure no longer as smooth as before. He had always been good at lying. always knew how to craft a story, to wear a mask that others believed. But tonight was different. His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm against the tabletop, betraying the nervous energy running through him. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the corners, the ceiling, the door, anywhere but at Chadwick Boseman, who stood opposite him, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. "Let's go over this one more time," Chadwick said, his voice steady, measured. "Tell me about Kristen Harper." Adam exhaled sharply, feigning exhaustion. "I've already told you, she's my daughter. We were traveling. That's all." Chadwick remained silent, letting the weight of the lie hang in the air. Then, without a word, he reached into the folder on the table and slid out a photograph. Kristen, wide-eyed and fearful, a missing person alert printed beneath her image. Adam's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "We know she's not your daughter," Adam scoffed, leaning back slightly. "Then why hasn't she said anything? If I kidnapped her, wouldn't she be screaming it to the world?" Jimmy had been listening from the other side of the one-way mirror, his fists clenched at his sides. He had seen men like Adam before, calculated, cold, always searching for a way out, but this time Adam had miscalculated. Sarah entered the room then, moving with quiet precision. She carried a stack of documents, which she placed on the table one by one. "Fake passports," she began. "Birth certificates, falsified adoption papers. And this," she slid forward another photo. 3 other missing children, all last seen in states where you happen to be. For the first time, Adam's fingers curled into fists. A crack, a shift. Jimmy could see it, but Adam still held on. "Coincidence," he muttered. Sarah leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not going to save you." While the interrogation continued, Jimmy led a team back to Lakeside Inn. He knew there had to be more. Blake wasn't working alone. The room where Adam had stayed was still sealed off with yellow police tape. It was a mess, drawers yanked open, sheets tangled, the stale odor of cigarettes clinging to the air, but there was something off. Jimmy moved carefully through the space, his eyes scanning every detail. Then, near the foot of the bed, he noticed it, a faint seam along the wooden flooring. A hatch. Heart pounding, he crouched down and pried it open. The crawl space beneath the room was small and suffocating, the air damp and thick with dust. A single suitcase sat in the center. Jimmy reached for it, unzipping it with steady hands, already dreading what he might find. Inside, passports. Dozens of them, each with different names, different ages, different children, all black. And then, at the bottom of the suitcase, a ledger. Jimmy flipped it open, his stomach twisting. Names, ages, prices. This wasn't just about Kristen. There were more. So many more. Back at the station, Kristen sat in a chair too big for her small frame. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the warm cup of tea Sarah had given her, but she wasn't drinking it. She had been silent since they brought her in, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she didn't know how to say it. But then Jimmy came back. Kristen looked up just as Jimmy entered the room. He crouched down, meeting her at eye level. "We found them," he said softly. "The other kids. We're going to stop them, Kristen." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, for the first time since her rescue, she spoke. "How many?" Her voice was small, fragile, but there was something stronger underneath it. Jimmy hesitated, but he owed her the truth. "More than we ever thought." Kristen's hands tightened around the cup. She didn't cry. Instead, she nodded. Jimmy saw it then. The fear was still there, but something new had taken root alongside it. Kristen wasn't the same little girl who had cowered in the back seat, afraid to speak. When Jimmy returned, she spoke again, her voice steadier. "Will you stop them?" Jimmy knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I promise." She studied him for a moment, then slowly reached for her doll, clutching it not out of fear, but out of resolve. She wasn't afraid anymore. The courthouse stood tall against the crisp morning sky, its stone facade bathed in pale sunlight. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones and cameras angled toward the grand doors as the world waited for the trial that had gripped the nation. The People versus Adam Blake. The name was on every headline, the face of a man who had spent years hiding behind a veneer of respectability, now exposed as a predator. Inside, the tension was thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators whispered among themselves, their voices hushed yet electric with anticipation. Kristen Harper sat with her parents near the front, her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed forward. She was here, but not as the frightened girl who had clung to her doll in the dark. She was here to face the man who had stolen her away. Jimmy Christian and Sarah Caldwell took their seats in the section reserved for investigators. They had done their part. Now, it was time for justice to speak. The judge entered, the room rising to its feet before settling into a silence so absolute that the shuffle of papers on the prosecutor's desk sounded deafening. Then it began. The prosecution wasted no time. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, damning. Photographs from the hidden crawl space at Lakeside Inn flashed on the screen. The discarded suitcase, the passports bearing different names, but the same familiar faces of missing children. Then came the ledger. Pages filled with numbers and notations, each one marking the unthinkable. "These are not coincidences," the prosecutor said, his voice sharp. "These are transactions, the buying and selling of human lives." Adam Blake, dressed in a grey suit that hung loosely on him, sat rigid, his face unreadable. But Jimmy saw it, the tightness in his jaw, the clenching of his hands beneath the table. The unraveling had begun. Kristen shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers gripping the hem of her dress. Her parents sat beside her, their presence a wall of quiet strength. And yet, Jimmy knew, the strongest person in that room was Kristen herself. The defense attorney stood, his polished shoes tapping against the floor with an air of forced confidence. His argument was simple, desperate even. "My client has no prior convictions. There is no direct evidence that he personally engaged in child trafficking. He merely provided shelter and guidance to children in need. Are we now punishing kindness?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of disbelief and disgust. The prosecutor didn't flinch. He reached for a document, lifted it, and held it up for all to see. "This is the forensic analysis of the fake passports found in Adam Blake's possession. The paper, the ink, the fingerprints, they all lead back to him. Every document used to erase these children's identities was tied to this man." A beat of silence. Then the final blow. "And let us not forget," the prosecutor continued, his voice lowering, steady, devastating, "the most powerful evidence in this case, the words of the victim herself." Jimmy felt the tension in his chest tighten as he watched Kristen stand. This was it. The bailiff approached, leading her toward the witness stand. She looked small, dwarfed by the imposing wooden structure, yet there was a steadiness in her steps. She settled into the chair, hands gripping the edges, her gaze momentarily flickering toward Adam. His stare met hers, cold, calculating. But this time Kristen didn't look away. The judge's voice was gentle. "Do you understand that you are here to tell the truth?" Kristen nodded. The prosecutor approached, his tone soft. careful. "Kristen, do you remember the man sitting at the defendant's table?" A deep breath, then a small voice but clear, unwavering. "Yes. Who is he?" "He's the man who took me." A hush fell over the room. The prosecutor knelt slightly, meeting her gaze. "Did you want to go with him?" A pause. Kristen's fingers curled against the wooden armrest. Then her voice, steady as steel. "No. He took me. I didn't want to go." There it was, the final fracture in Adam Blake's carefully crafted mask. For the first time since the trial began, he reacted, a sharp inhale, a tightening around his eyes. He had lost. It didn't take long for the jury to deliberate. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too damning. When the foreperson stood, the entire room leaned forward. On the charge of child abduction, guilty. On the charge of human trafficking, guilty. On the charge of forgery and conspiracy, guilty. On all counts, guilty. A collective exhale filled the room, a breath held for too long, finally released. Jimmy turned his head slightly, catching the moment Adam realized it was over. His expression remained neutral, but his fingers twitched against the table, his knuckles white. As the bailiff approached to take him away, he turned just for a second, locking eyes with Jimmy. There was no remorse, only hatred. But Jimmy didn't care. This wasn't about Adam Blake anymore. It was about Kristen and every child he had taken before her. It was about justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing as Kristen and her parents stepped into the sunlight. Her mother held her close, her father shielding them both from the press. Kristen didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jimmy and Sarah watched from a distance. "You did good," Sarah murmured. Jimmy nodded, but his eyes were already on the next battle. Because Samuel Cross was still out there, and if there was one thing Jimmy knew for certain, evil like this didn't stop with one conviction. He turned to Sarah, his jaw set. "We're not done." Sarah's smile was grim. "Not even close." As Kristen climbed into the car with her family, she glanced back one last time. Her gaze met Jimmy's, and this time she smiled first. The atmosphere inside the precinct was heavy with quiet anticipation. Officers moved about, their voices hushed, their footsteps purposeful. But in one corner of the room, where a single child sat, time seemed to have slowed. Kristen sat stiffly in the chair, hands resting in her lap, fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her sweater. The warmth of the tea Sarah had given her had long since faded, but she still clung to the cup, as if afraid to let go. It was something solid, something real. The air smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint metallic scent of the handcuffs that had been locked around Adam Blake's wrists only hours ago. But for Kristen, the strongest scent was something invisible yet overwhelming, the fear of what came next. She had spent so long running, so long fearing what lay ahead. And now, she was about to walk into something even more terrifying. Home. The door creaked open, a voice soft, trembling, barely above a whisper. "Kristen." The cup slipped from her hands, landing with a soft clatter against the table. Kristen turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Her mother stood just beyond the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. Behind her, Kristen's father looked as if he hadn't slept in days, his hands gripping each other so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then, Kristen ran. "Me oi!" Her voice cracked as she threw herself forward, her small arms wrapping around her mother's waist, clinging so tightly as if afraid she might disappear again. Her mother collapsed onto her knees, sobbing into Kristen's hair, her fingers trembling as they cupped her daughter's face, touching her cheeks, her forehead, as if to make sure she was real. Kon nomi lam. Kristen's words were muffled against the fabric of her mother's coat, her body shaking with emotion. Her father knelt beside them, his arms wrapping around them both, his face buried in Kristen's hair. No one else in the room spoke. Even the officers, who had seen countless reunions like this before, stood in solemn silence, giving the family their moment. Sarah turned her head slightly, blinking away the moisture in her own eyes. And Jimmy, he stood near the back watching, feeling something inside him unclench. Kristen was home. She was safe. And for the first time in a long time, she was a child again. Minutes passed before Kristen finally pulled away, wiping at her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her sweater. Her mother's hands never left her, as if afraid she might vanish if they weren't touching. Her father turned toward Jimmy, his eyes filled with gratitude so deep it couldn't be put into words. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Jimmy gave a small shake of his head. You don't have to." Kristen hesitated, then turned toward him. Her eyes, no longer filled with fear, met his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without warning, she ran forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Thank you for saving me." Her voice was small, but strong. Jimmy felt something lodge in his throat. Slowly, carefully, he placed a hand on her back, returning the embrace with quiet warmth. No medal, no commendation, no newspaper article could ever compare to this moment. This was what mattered. Not the arrests, not the case files. This. As Kristen finally stepped back, her mother took her hand, gently guiding her toward the exit. The three of them moved as one, a family reunited. And as the door swung shut behind them, Jimmy exhaled. He had done something good, something that mattered. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Sarah appeared at his side, arms crossed. She didn't have to speak for Jimmy to know what she was thinking. A few moments later, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, glancing at the screen before looking up at him. "FBI just called," she said, her tone sharper now. "They found something. Another location. Samuel Cross might be running an operation out of an old warehouse south of here." Jimmy didn't react right away. He simply nodded, looking past her, out the window, where the darkened sky stretched endlessly above the city. For Kristen, it was over. But there were more children out there. More families waiting for their own reunions. And he wasn't about to let them wait any longer. "Let's go," he said. He reached for his coat, pushing open the precinct door. The night air was crisp, filled with the distant sounds of the city settling into the early hours of morning. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. The world was quiet, but inside the war room at the Federal Building, the tension was suffocating. Jimmy Christian sat at the long table, scanning the maps and files spread before him. It had been weeks since Adam Blake's arrest, but the fight was far from over. Sarah stood beside him, flipping through pages of case reports, witness statements, and surveillance photos. Each one led back to the same name, Samuel Cross. A ghost. A man who had never been officially charged, never left a trace behind. And yet, his shadow lingered over every case they touched. "He's careful," Sarah murmured, tapping her fingers against a blurry image from a security camera. A tall figure, always just out of reach. "Every operation we've uncovered, every lead we've followed, it all stops short at him." Jimmy exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had spent his whole career chasing bad men, but this wasn't just a man. This was an empire. "Then we don't stop," he said, his voice steady. "We tear the whole thing down." The investigation took them across state lines, hidden back rooms, forged identities, and whispered deals. What they were chasing was bigger than any of them had imagined. At a rundown office building in Chicago, they found stacks of falsified birth certificates, children who had been erased and rewritten into new lives. In an abandoned warehouse in New Orleans, they discovered hidden ledgers detailing transactions, movements, and names of those who were bought and sold. Each step led deeper into a system built on stolen innocence. Kristen's name wasn't in those files, but she could have been. And that was the thought that kept Jimmy awake at night. One evening, long after the day's work had bled into another sleepless night, Jimmy sat alone at his desk, staring at the flickering screen. He had started this journey thinking it was about catching one man, about stopping Samuel Cross. But now, staring at the list of hundreds of missing children, he knew the truth. "We could take him down tomorrow," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And it still wouldn't be enough. Sarah, sitting across from him, nodded. Because it's not just one man. It never was. Jimmy clenched his jaw. He had spent years believing that locking away the right criminals would make the world a safer place. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became evil didn't die with the men who carried it. It just found new hands to hold it. They weren't just fighting one monster, they were fighting a machine. And that meant they couldn't stop. Another night, another shift. The red and blue lights of his patrol car reflected off the quiet streets as Jimmy drove through town, his eyes scanning the roads like they always did. Even after everything, the arrests, the trials, the cases still open, he knew the truth. Somewhere out there, another child was being taken. Another name would be added to the lists he had memorized. Another face would stare back at him from a missing persons report. And maybe tonight he wouldn't be there to stop it. But tomorrow he will still be here, still watching, still fighting. Because justice wasn't about winning. It was about never giving up. And that's where our story leaves us tonight. But let's be honest, justice never really ends, does it? Jimmy Christian may have closed one chapter, but out there, in the shadows of the world, the fight goes on. Another missing child, another name on a list, another monster hiding behind a mask. And that's why people like Jimmy, people like Sarah, don't stop. Because justice isn't about winning, it's about never giving up. So, what did you think of tonight's story? Did it keep you on the edge of your seat? If you love deep, emotional thrillers that explore the resilience of the human spirit, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories just like this one. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.